negotiators on the pensions with us today, Sam Marsh, taking time from an incredibly hectic schedule in Sheffield to be with us. Sam is based in maths and stats and is a university teacher at Sheffield. And he has been tirelessly and working just about every hour of every day trying to maintain our pensions. So I think, before anything else, we just want to express all of our gratitude to you for all the efforts that you've made to understand the situation, to help others to understand it, and to try and address it. I'm now going to turn over to Sam, and I think first of all I might need to unmute you, so give me a moment to just figure out how to do that, and then it will be over to you.
Thanks. I think it's let me do it.
Brilliant.
Good. Yes. Thank you. So thanks for the introduction. I certainly haven't been working every hour of every day, as I'm sure all good trade unionists would say. Yeah, personal life is important, and I've certainly managed to reserve some of that. But it has been a slog for the last how long? Four or more years. I've been on the Joint Negotiating Committee. And the other thing to say is it's not just me working tirelessly. There's been lots of people putting in huge amounts of effort. The other negotiators, officials at UCU. It really is quite a slog being involved in USS, as I'm sure you can appreciate. So now, some apologies to start with. I'm working to contract and didn't get the opportunity to make any slides. So I'm just going to, I've got a kind of rough plan of what I'm going to say, but I hope it all fits together and is intelligible with me just talking. But hopefully I'll reserve plenty of time for questions at the end. So if anything wasn't clear, you can ask for clarification. Right. OK, now it's always difficult to know where to start with this story. I'm guessing many of you are well versed in some of it, but I'll make an arbitrary decision to start around a year ago or thereabouts. And what happened then? Well, about a year ago, USS showed to us and sent to employers the outcome of their 2020 valuation. Now, it was bad news. We were expecting bad news because, of course, the 2020 valuation was set or conducted as of the market conditions from the 31st of March 2020, which was a couple of weeks into lockdown. The markets were in chaos, and we knew that if you tried to value a scheme based on data from that date, it was going to be bad. And we'd had some indications actually going back 6 months prior to that the numbers they were thinking of looked terrible. But when they finally announced them in March last year, our worst fears were confirmed. They were asking for potentially up to 57% of salary to retain current benefits with the scheme as it was. Now, at that point, we had been working well with Universities UK, who represent the employers, and they reacted to this valuation in a way that, well, had some credibility to it. They wrote quite a sternly worded letter back to the USS trustee saying, we don't recognise this as an appropriate valuation of the scheme. I forget precisely which terms they used, but all sorts of things like unrealistic or certainly unaffordable was almost certainly in there. And they asked for a review of the valuation. Now, I'm sure a lot of you know what happened next. The trustee wrote back to Universities UK saying, no, we're perfectly happy with our valuation and we're proceeding. Now, that was the key moment. At that point, Universities UK could have shown their mettle and shown they were on the side of staff by sticking to their guns and saying, no, this is not acceptable to run a valuation in the middle of a pandemic and ask us to pay either huge amounts more for pensions or look at benefit changes, essentially cuts to staff. That's what they could have done. I think that's what they should have done. Instead, what they did was swiftly pivoted and revealed a proposal that would see huge cuts to our benefits. So essentially, they gave up. They gave up on the valuation. They gave up trying to push for any other different outcome. They gave up. Up until that point, they'd even commissioned some work by their actuary that showed or seemed to suggest that an update to March 2021 would be beneficial. But at that point, they changed tack. They decided, forget about any updated valuation. For them, it was about protecting themselves, ensuring that they wouldn't have to pay any more towards our pensions, and therefore to look for the path of least resistance, which was to cut benefits for staff. OK, so they came up with this proposal. I think it was about April last year when they first announced their proposal. And it's pretty much the proposal that came in or is coming in in just a couple of weeks. So that involves cuts to what we call the accrual rate. That's the rate at which defined benefits are built up. Until the changes that are due to come in a couple of weeks, we were being promised a 75th of our salary back in retirement, and that's changing to an 85th of our salary back in retirement. The other aspect that they were changing was what's called the defined benefit threshold, which is the limit in salary terms to the accrual of defined benefits. At the moment, if you earn up to £60,000 or thereabouts, then your pension is a defined benefit pension, one of these ones where you're paid a proportion of your salary back in retirement. Those earning over that threshold, well, they get defined benefits up to the threshold, but above the threshold, they start getting something called a defined contribution pension, which is essentially money in an investment pot with your name on it. And the change that UUK proposed and have now managed to get implemented and starting in a couple of weeks was to reduce that from 60,000 to 40,000. So now those earning anything over 40,000 will start to be drawn into this defined contribution scheme with defined benefits capped at 40,000. Okay, the third and final main aspect to their cuts was around inflation, and this is obviously a huge topic. Inflation is soaring at the moment. Energy prices not lowest amongst the things that's causing this pressure, and that's been exacerbated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, of course, which is a very sorry story. But the effects on inflation, so I just read an article this lunchtime while I was sitting in the sunshine eating my lunch, that says that inflation is now expected to reach 10% at some point this year. So what was it the UUK proposed? Well, it was to cap the inflation protection in the defined benefit scheme. And what that means is, so I said earlier that you'd get paid a proportion of your salary back in retirement. Of course, you want that to be protected relative to inflation. And the current arrangements in the scheme are if inflation runs up to 5%, it's fully protected. And then you get half of the increase from there up to 15% inflation, and then there's a cap from then on. What Universities UK have introduced in their proposals is to cap the inflation protection at 2.5%, meaning anytime CPI inflation goes over 2.5%, your pension erodes in real terms. Okay, so that was their proposal. We didn't like it one bit, as you can imagine, and of course, this was all about saving themselves money. I think it's fair to characterise the Universities UK position as a no detriment position, which is a phrase that many in UCU are familiar with from some of our previous positions that we've taken into disputes. But essentially, UUK said this is what we currently pay, we won't pay any more, and therefore the cost of the valuation will have to be met by members. Right, okay, so that was UUK's proposals. They came out in around April last year. UCU worked on some proposals. The valuation was almost impossible to work within and get anything that members might see as acceptable, but we tried our best. We came up with some proposals that involved all kinds of different aspects, including a lower member rate to compensate for what would be some of the cuts that UUK were proposing, but an increased employer rate. They were going to have to go up from around 21.4% of salary to closer to 25%, and also options for members to reduce their rates to either 4% or 0% and still accrue benefits. So this was a kind of our best attempt to come up with anything that members might see as acceptable alternative to striking. Now, the question was, what happens to those proposals? Well, the first thing was that UUK said to us that for their own proposals, they were prepared to offer what USS had termed covenant support, which was additional covenant support, which meant the covenant is a term that talks about the sort of support for the scheme given by employers. And USS had been saying that they needed more support from employers for the scheme. What did they want? They wanted a moratorium on exits. In other words, they wanted employers to legally bind themselves for the scheme for a certain length of time. And 20 years is the kind of length of time that we ended up settling on in that circumstance. USS also wanted employers to not issue any, let me get this right, secured debt. Yes, that's right, not unsecured debt, secured debt that they were talking about, without giving USS equal standing on the security. So this is something called pari passu standing on the debt. And they also wanted to be able to monitor institutions' finances. They wanted to be able to check, in particular, the levels of debt in the sector. And if they weren't happy with how things were going, they wanted to reserve the right to, in some sense, tell universities how to get their finances in order. Possible overreach by USS, but in some sense it does provide the scheme with more solidity. So UUK had said they'd essentially agreed to these points, but only if they got their way with their proposals. What they said to us was, your proposals, we won't provide that covenant support for. Therefore, check with USS what the pricing is. And when we went back to USS with our proposals, of course, the answer was, well, if UUK aren't providing the covenant support in the case of your proposals, then we have to reconsider the price and it will be significantly higher. Essentially, what this meant was our proposals no longer became viable at the price that we'd had them priced at. They would have been viable had Universities UK agreed to provide this covenant support, irrespective of which proposal was being put to the JNC, but UUK ensured that only their proposal was able to go to the vote at the Joint Negotiating Committee. Now, a lot of you know the structure of the Joint Negotiating Committee. There are two parties there. There's UCU and Universities UK and an independent chair. And in the case of a disagreement between the two parties, the independent chair has a casting vote. So in this situation, and this was last August, the chair was faced with only one proposal on the table. That was Universities UK. UK's proposal. Ours couldn't be put to a vote because of this lack of covenant support. And what that meant was the chair had to either decide between UUK's proposal or the cost sharing fallback, which would have seen rates go as high as 57% on a cost sharing basis. Now, you know what happened. The chair sided with Universities UK, but I think it is worth noting that they were unable to vote for UCU's proposal because we were unable to put it to a vote because Universities UK had withdrawn the covenant support. Right, so that proposal in around late October or early November last year went for a consultation with members. You were able to give your thoughts on this proposal, and I hope you let rip. You might be a little bit disappointed to know that the only people who read your free text comments were the executive team at USS, who then prepared a summary report for the board at USS and also for the Joint Negotiating Committee, but neither the Joint Negotiating Committee nor the board, who are the decision-making bodies, saw your free text comments. All we got was a summary of whether you approved or disapproved of the various elements and a ranking of what members saw as the best way to deal with evaluation. Now, the interesting thing of that, coming out of that consultation, was that the most widely viewed solution to the increased or the terrible valuation was, okay, if I go back a step, probably was to scrap it and start again, which would be an entirely defensible position. But if forced to pick between, I think there were 4 different options of how to deal with it, namely cut accrual rates, move defined benefit cap, reduce inflation protection, or increase contributions, by far the most popular was to increase contributions and protect benefits. So with that in mind, UCU modified their proposals. We came up with a new proposal at the end of January, which was to firstly that we wanted employers to join with us to call for a new valuation, essentially recognise that the 2020 valuation is not a sound basis for these cuts. Secondly, to agree not to modify benefits for the coming year, so that's 1st of April, starting in a couple of weeks for a year, and that would have seen a modest rise in contribution levels, not all the way up to this 57%. USS said for the first year they would accept a lower amount, and then to commit to the best benefits that could be achieved either as a result of a new valuation or if it's not yet completed, the best benefits that can be achieved within whatever framework we're working on, where members pay 9.8% and employers pay 25.2%. Now, this was a well thought out proposal. It was certified by USS as reasonable. We came out with it on something like the 26th of January. Universities UK reacted immediately, or well, certainly the next day, with a statement that said this didn't look like a serious attempt to resolve the dispute from UCU. You might think they were perhaps overstepping their remit as the voice of their members. They perhaps should have waited until they'd heard what the employers had made of our proposals. They didn't. They decided to weigh in to cut them down before they'd consulted. They then refused to consult on them until USS had given them the rubber stamp, which was also an unnecessary step. Interestingly, they did consult on a modified version of their own proposals without awaiting the rubber stamp from USS. USS took a good week or more to come up with that rubber stamping, which was kind of a formality, but a process that needed to be gone through. Anyway, it allowed UUK to prevaricate on their consultation. Eventually, they consulted with about a week before our strike action started. And we've seen emails they sent to employers to accompany the consultation, and essentially they undermine our proposal in every way they can think of. So in fact, I've missed out some steps because it's such a convoluted story of UUK trying to savage our proposals. The first thing they did was misrepresented what we were saying by pretending that we weren't able to cap rates at 25.2% and 9.8% by April 2023, and trying to trick institutions into thinking that our proposal either didn't work or was dishonest or something. So that was their first attempt. And their second attempt occurs in an email that I've seen, you probably haven't seen because it's confidential, that accompanied the full text of our proposal, in which they no longer misrepresented what they were saying. They just took every opportunity in that email. There was a list of about 10 bullet points, where each bullet point was essentially undermining our proposal, saying why they thought it was a terrible idea. And then, of course, the email closed with, nevertheless, tell us what you think about UCU's proposal, and we will consider how to respond at the JNC. So essentially, UUK ensured our proposal didn't get a fair hearing. What did employers do with that information from UUK? Well, they unanimously rejected our proposal, and in doing so said that they wouldn't provide the covenant support that was necessary to make it work. Yes, deja vu. This is the same trick that they did in August. That meant that the only proposal that was costed and could be put to a vote at the JNC at the end of February. So perhaps I should explain why there needed to be a vote at the end of February. The JNC had to confirm, as a response to the member consultation, what it wanted to do at the end of February. So we were supposed to take into account what members had told us and then make the final decisions. So a new vote was needed. UCU had responded to the consultation. Employers had barely changed their offering and undercut ours by refusing the covenant support. Again, it went to the chair's casting vote and it got voted through with, so yeah, the UUK proposals got voted through and ratified by the board. And that meant that USS went into gear preparing for the 1st of April when they say these cuts will take effect. Right, okay, so where are we now? Well, we are in the middle of a dispute. We've had cuts forced onto us despite the action we've taken so far. There's more action due starting on Monday for some institutions and a week on Monday for others. I forget where the Open University is in that, but I'm sure you know. Well, actually, you'll have to tell me whether you made the threshold. I'm pretty sure you did, but anyway, you will know better than me. Apologies for not doing my homework. Now, there is a joint negotiating committee meeting on the 29th of March. That's a week on Tuesday. Technically, that meeting could overturn these cuts, and if it did, USS would probably have to swiftly work to backtrack on the preparations they've been making. Will that meeting overturn these cuts? Almost certainly not. I mean, it's just possible that the strike action will be so overwhelming starting on Monday and a week on Monday that by the 29th of March, employers are begging us to stop and we'll reverse the cuts. But they've lasted out this far, and I think it's unlikely that they'll be coming to that meeting and saying they're prepared to rip up their cuts. But there are other aspects going on at the moment, which I think are directly relevant and help build the pressure. So legal action. Some of you may know, and some of you may have contributed to a crowd-funded action that's being brought by Neil Davis of Bristol and Ewan McGaughey of King's College. They're both committee members for UCU at their institutions, but they've launched a legal challenge as members of the scheme, crowd-funded. They got through their first hearing in February. So it's a three-stage process. They got through their first hearing in February, which was, it wasn't quite a formality, but it didn't really look at the merits of the case. It was around, well, it looked at some of the merits of the case. It didn't look at the substantive arguments around the case that they ultimately want to bring. It was more a case of whether they were entitled to proceed. Second hearing happens on the 28th of March, and this is what's called a contested hearing. USS will have lawyers present, and what Neil and Ewan are asking for permission for at that hearing is to take the directors of the scheme to court using USS's assets, the scheme, the funds from the scheme, to do so. Essentially, they will act as the pension scheme, taking the directors to court if they get permission at that hearing. So it's quite an important hearing, because as part of that hearing, if they get permission to proceed, they will also ask for an injunction to be applied so that the cuts wouldn't come in on the 1st of April. Now, of course, USS have said there's no merits in their claim and they will fight them, etc., etc. But this is a potential opening that Neil and Ewan have come up with, and I think they need our support. They have now reached their crowdfunding target, by the way, as of yesterday. So, but they may still need money. I don't know what the situation is. You could certainly see what they're tweeting at the moment. Okay, so throw legal action into the mix and things get more interesting. There is also a question as to whether USS broke the rules of the scheme in how they set up the negotiation process. Twice I mentioned how Universities UK said they would withdraw covenant support for our proposal. If you track back why they were able to do that, as I have, what I think you find is that the way that USS set up the J&C negotiations this time, which was different to any other valuation, has broken the scheme rules. And that was the source of the loophole that Universities UK were able to exploit. I think this absolutely needs challenging in the courts. I have been in discussion with UCU about this legal challenge to see whether UCU can back it. It's at the moment, discussions are ongoing and legal advice is being sought. It's unlikely to be heard in time to prevent the cuts. Neil and Ewan's action will be heard on the 28th of March. That could come with an injunction. Any other legal action, given how time is ticking, is unlikely to be ready in time. There's one more aspect to legal action that I think is well worth mentioning. Some of you, I hope many of you will remember Jane Hutton, who was a UCU nominated director of the USS scheme. She was one of the people on the board of USS put there by UCU. She did sterling work challenging the valuation assumptions and asking for things to be backed up by evidence. You'll remember, I hope, that she ended up whistleblowing to the regulator and then to the Financial Times, and as a result of that, she was dismissed from the USS board in October 2019, perhaps. I may have got the wrong year. No, I think that's the right one, October 2019. Now, she's been waiting a long time to take USS to court over her dismissal, and she has an employment tribunal coming up. The last I heard, it will be happening in May, but I may be out of date. There's been huge delays in the court system due to COVID, and she's been waiting a long time to have her case heard. When that case is heard, there will be all sorts of documents put in the public domain that I think will put huge amounts of pressure on USS as to how they acted in regards to how they treated Jane, and on matters relating to the valuation. So that's going to be another interesting element to this. Okay, one more thing to talk about is reballoting. So not only is there action being called for later this month, starting next week, but there's a reballot underway. And now, why are we reballoting? Well, because this story is not over yet. We don't know precisely what we will do with a mandate when we get it, but we certainly hope to have one in our pockets, because I mean, I hope I've convinced you that there are issues that are very much unresolved, issues that are being challenged in the court, and we need to be ready to pounce and capitalise on any developments that we can, applying pressure when we need to. So precisely what will happen with a new mandate on USS, I don't know. That's for discussion at various decision-making conferences and committees. Your branch will have delegates that can go to a conference to discuss strategy. I don't know whether you have representatives here on the Higher Education Committee of UCU. That's not a committee I'm on either, but there'll be strategic decisions taken there as well. But this story is far from over. So where will this all end up? Well, I can't tell you for sure. I very much hope there's happier days ahead for the scheme and for members' pensions. If you'd have asked me a year ago where I thought the most optimistic sort of long-term vision for the scheme was, I would have talked about conditional indexation, which is something that UCU have indicated that we're prepared to explore with employers. What is conditional indexation? Well, it's a form of the defined benefit scheme in which the inflation protection isn't as strong as it currently is, but its inflation protection is provided as long as the assets perform well enough. So essentially, most of our arguments have revolved around a valuation which is unduly pessimistic about the future investment prospects. In fact, we've used terms like recklessly prudent with regards to those investment returns. Conditional indexation would be a way of putting our money where our mouth is, where we say we're prepared to take a hit in our pensions, but only if the investments perform as badly as you say they're going to perform. If, in fact, investments perform in line with what we assume they will do, then our pensions will not need to be cut. It's only in the situation that your dire projections are correct that we'd be happy to accept some kind of cuts to our benefits. Okay, now I can't really give you the full description of conditional indexation in a minute, so I think I will leave that there. Happy to answer further questions. I said that's what I would have seen the future of the scheme as a year ago. I think what's happened in the last months has made it very difficult to proceed in good faith with employers looking at conditional indexation in the near future. They are going to have to behave much better before we start trusting them to work with them on a scheme that would be very delicate to implement properly. It would need a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? A lot of cooperation, a lot of working together to ensure that a scheme was created that suited certainly the membership as well as the employers in the scheme. And relationships have been strained too far in recent months for productive talks to happen along those lines at the moment. But a few years down the line could come back and could still be a future for the scheme. Right, okay, I clearly should have written some slides and that would have stopped me from talking for so long. But I hope that gives you an overview of what's happened over the last year and where we are now.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. I think really, really clear and helpful. What we're going to do now is we're going to stop recording.